Live from beyond the Beltway, this is Bruce DuMont with our weekly analysis of national politics, with occasional injections of rumor and innuendo, all offered up by our panel of political insiders, pundits, power brokers, public servants, professors, and most importantly, plain-speaking Americans from coast to coast. Tonight featuring commentary by veteran political analyst Bill Schneider, Republican businessman Chris Veronis, George Violoshin, a lawyer who was born in Ukraine. Brian Castle in hour number 2 of 4-Star Wealth Advisors will lead the discussion about the future of the Republican Party. Libertarian Eric Cohn joins us from Grand Rapids, Michigan, and we'll also hear from Gerald Petchnick, who is with the LaRouche PAC. And yes, the Lyndon LaRouche PAC is still around, and we're gonna hear what they're up to, because they have candidates that are running for political office. We come to you tonight from our new home base at AM 560, The Answer, WIND in Chicago, in beautiful Elk Grove Village, Illinois. And again, we've got great guests, 2 hours, lots to discuss this evening. Always interested in your calls at 1-800-723-8289. I want to begin with Bill Schneider. Bill, nice to have you with us. You've been a guest on this program numerous times over the probably the last 30 years. I think we've known each other at least that long. And Chris Veronis joins us in studio. But I want to begin with you, since the big story has been obviously the speech by President Zelensky to the Capitol this week, Congress this week. In your memory, is there any world political figure that has attained the level of almost adoration and admiration that President Zelensky has received in your distinguished career?
Well, are you talking about a living figure?
Yeah. Well, I mean, somebody that you know. I mean, somebody that the audience would know or remember.
Well, some of us who are of a certain age might remember a man named Winston Churchill, who I believe addressed Congress,
right?
Maybe more than once. He was revered and esteemed during World War II and after World War II, when he was a leader of the free world, even though he was voted out of office initially in Britain. But I think Zelensky is approaching Churchillian levels of respect and admiration, because he's a wartime leader who speaks for his country and speaks out in defiance of the Russians, who are ancient enemies of the United States.
Do you think there was a time that Fidel Castro was held in high esteem, at least by the media and a lot of people in television? Certainly Jack Paar was one of his big supporters, a talk show host at the time. Again, not in the same league, but no. He was pretty popular until we found out that he was a communist.
Well, that's true, but I don't think he was ever held in that high esteem.
Right.
He was a figure of curiosity, some respect, because he had overthrown a dictator in Cuba. But in terms of esteem and admiration, I don't think Castro comes close to where Zelensky is today.
Yeah. Chris Veronis joins us. Chris, nice to have you back with us on the program. You were a businessman and a very successful one in the public affairs field. You're one of the few people that I've heard, as you came into the studio this evening, you're not. I don't want to say you're not a fan of Zelensky's, but you sort of panned his speech to Congress.
I, like the rest of the world, I can't help but admire Volodymyr Zelensky. I think that one of the most telling moments is when, and by the way, this was an embarrassment for the United States, let's not forget, where we went to him and said, we will help evacuate you.
Right.
I've been sending the message that you can't last.
That was day one.
It was day one, and it's kind of shameful that overture was extended, and he said, no, I don't need a ride. I need ammunition, rightfully. And so there's a Shakespeare line about, sometimes the man affects times, and sometimes the times affects the man. And I think just like George W. Bush in the days after 9/11, I think you're seeing the same thing with Volodymyr Zelensky. Now, a lot of courage.
What about this speech?
You give him props for what he's done, how he's led the country. This speech, quite honestly, was sort of a drive-by understanding of American culture and history right now. It was very clumsy. Very awkward, where he's kind of summoning the sacred texts and words of American history, like I Have a Dream, and then kind of bring it back to him. I have a need, like you need to send me MiGs, and then him saying. Almost like in a kind of a lecturing kind of way, Joe Biden, you're the leader of America. Well, you need to be the leader of the world. I mean, do you have any idea that this country has been through 2 wars for the last 20 years? That's the last thing people want to hear. Now, none of that really matters because there's been universal acclaim for the speech.
How do you think that affects Joe Biden? Because when I heard it, it was like, okay, here's a guy trying to feed something in Joe Biden that makes him wake up and do a little bit more. I want to get Bill's response, but finish your point, and I want to get Bill's response. How Biden responds to this?
Well, Biden did respond. They knew this. He was going to address Congress, and hours after the speech, he wrote Ukraine an $800 million check, and so. There you have it. The United States is responding, but anything beyond that is really dubious, and I would question it severely.
Bill, any agreement on any of that criticism of the speech?
Well, I don't agree with the criticism that the speech was poor in tone and didn't hit the right notes. I thought it was an effective speech, mostly because of who he is and what he's doing. He's standing up to the Russians and leading his beleaguered nation, which is much weaker than Russia is. He looks like a valiant war leader who really doesn't have much of a chance of winning, and although his chances are getting better. I think Americans respect and admire him. Biden is in more of a fix because there's a limit on what he can do and what he's able to do and what politically he can do. Americans do not want to send troops to fight Russia in Ukraine. They simply don't, and he knows that. So there's a limit on what Biden can do. The problem is, whenever there's been a threat to world order or to humanitarian values since World War II, if the United States doesn't step up and do something, nothing will happen. Yeah. We're trying to step up and do something now. Imagine what would have happened if we hadn't done anything when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in 1990. Nothing. Kuwait would be part of Iraq.
Are we doing enough, though, Bill? I mean, based on your assessment, because you've seen all these situations before, do you think, are we doing enough? Is there any more? I don't know rhetorically whether we can do more.
No, well, everyone says, can we send troops? I don't think that's likely or even politically possible. We're giving a fortune in aid. I think there's we're doing about as much as we can do. The only question Americans are going to ask is it working? Is it going to keep Ukraine intact, or is it still going to lose to the Russians? That would look very bad for Biden.
What about conservative Republicans? When are conservative Republicans going to say, "Hey, this is costing too much money"? Or going to be asking those questions? Chris, are they going to be asked?
Last I checked, the threshold of what is acceptable, is getting higher and higher and higher. I think quadrillion is next after trillion, if I'm not mistaken. So I think the $35 billion that we've spent right now is a drop in the bucket.
Okay. 1-800-723-8029 from coast to coast and border to border around the world at BeyondTheBeltway.com. This is Bruce DuMont. This is Beyond the Beltway. We'll be back in just a few moments.
Oh, hello. These days, I'm often quoted as saying, you can't believe everything you read on the internet. People forget that I was the first technology president, using the telegraph, T-mails as I like to call them, to communicate with my generals. Well, today, we are fighting a cybersecurity war, and our best defense is for folks to follow some of these tips when they're online. If it seems too good to be true, it probably is. Hover your cursor over links to determine the true web address. Look for misspellings and poor grammar, which are warning signs of fraud. Be suspicious of emails requesting urgent action, and never give away sensitive personal information. With malware for none, with cyber protection for all. This is your humble servant, Abraham Lincoln.
The central and midwestern U.S. averages more than 850 tornadoes each year, and lately, the number of floods has been rising in the region too. So chances are, there will be more twisters and floods near here again. And between school, sports, and social lives, chances are, you won't be with your kids when it happens. Will they know what to do? Ready.gov/kids has all the educational tools and information to make the conversation easy. When the time comes, chances are they'll feel prepared, not scared. So talk with your family today.
Bruce DuMont back. We continue with our guest, Chris Veronis, in studio. Bill Schneider joins us from Washington, D.C. Bill, as the politics on this are playing out, have all the sides, do you think, are they all lined up at the moment, or at what point might there be some criticism or questioning of our current policy?
You're talking about Ukraine?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, you're hearing criticism from Republicans who had a little trouble getting started because they were in a trap. Trump praised Putin, and they didn't know what to do.
Right.
Because the country is clearly anti-Putin. It's almost unanimous. I'll give you an interesting figure. 70% of Republicans have an unfavorable view of Putin. But you know what? 77% have an unfavorable view of President Biden. So they want to criticize President Biden without criticizing his support for Putin, who is widely supported even by Republicans. And so what the Republicans have decided to do is attack Biden as being weak. That's his chief vulnerability in this election. He's considered a weak president.
Or
Americans
slow.
say that. Most Americans do not consider him a strong president. And Republicans are going to argue that this entire war is a result of Biden's weakness in world affairs.
Do you think there's something to that criticism, Chris?
I do. I'm on the right. I consider myself a conservative Republican, disaffected, but also generally supportive of the way the president's been handling this. Okay, it's a very narrow real estate he's got to travel on. There's been some blunders. I just don't understand why Putin gets to decide the red lines over the MiGs. Why are we voluntarily saying out loud the quiet part, what we won't do? Whatever happened to that language? You heard Liz Cheney say it this morning. All options are on the table. Why aren't we using that language? Why aren't we trying to put Vladimir Putin off balance?
Well, he also Biden mentions World War III more often than I think he should. I mean, he seems to be reminding people that that's one of the options. I think that's one of the reasons why there is some reluctance on the part, because people are not looking for that. But the language means a lot. And to what extent, for the future of the party, Bill, has the vice president and her conduct and rhetoric abroad, how badly has that hurt the Democratic Party, if it really has hurt the party?
Well, I'm not sure it's made a difference at this point, but a lot of Democrats, when they stop to think about it, they realize that Biden is almost 80 years old. He'll be 82 in 2024. He may decide not to run for a second term. He may not be able to run for a second term, in which case Kamala Harris, the vice president, would succeed him as president. And if he decides not to run in 2024, she is very likely to be the Democratic nominee. So there's a lot of discussion of her qualifications, her lack of qualifications, her lack of national experience. She is respected in California, where she has a good record as a prosecutor, but she's pretty much unknown in the rest of the country. And of course, being an African-American woman is something unfamiliar to a lot of Americans in a lot of the country. So I don't think opinions of her are very strong, but they are not a big plus.
She may not be respected in the White House. Their knives are out for Kamala Harris in certain corners of the White House. Aside from getting like a political impossibility that is immigration that was given to her, that was put into her portfolio, she was sent over to Poland, and then the White House tweeted out she has no negotiating authority, like pulling the rug from underneath her. There are people, you talk about Democratic infighting, I think there's an example right there in the White House.
Well, I think if you got a group of Democrats together and they were all off the record and had a couple of belts in them. I don't think there's too many of them would say that she would be a strong standard bearer in 2024 if Joe Biden, for whatever reason, decides not to run. Bill, do you agree with that? I mean, would there be a strong Kamala Harris cadre in politics that would be rallying around her, or would they all be looking for an option that they could work around? And if so,
Blacks
what
would rally
that
to
option
her.
be?
Blacks would rally to her as she would be the second Black president. A lot of women would rally to her around the country. Liberal Democratic women would rally to her support. I think she would get the nomination if it's open in 2024. Vice presidents always do, except with one or two exceptions, like Dan Quayle, who ran for about 2 weeks and he was getting nowhere because he was running against George H.W. Bush's son. That meant the whole nomination was blocked. But no, I think Democrats are not optimistic about her prospects, but they might see her as inevitable.
Yeah.
So there isn't a road for a Pete Buttigieg who has been given a lot of positive promotion by the national media.
It would be interesting, but I don't see an obvious road. If she runs, if Biden does not run and she runs, it'll be a competitive race, as it always is. But the vice president always wins. Look, Richard Nixon after Eisenhower, Hubert Humphrey after Lyndon Johnson, Al Gore after Bill Clinton. The vice president, if they run, get the nomination.
Would you be?
And then they lose.
I think.
Would you be would you be licking your chops for that?
I would. I absolutely would. She's a horrifyingly bad candidate. She didn't even make it to Iowa. She had to bow out. And she became the vice presidential nominee because she checked all the boxes.
But what about all the historical points that Bill just made?
Those Black Democratic primary voters have proven to be more pragmatic than they're given credit for. I mean, they voted for the dead man walking, Joe Biden, in the Democratic primary this year. And, quite frankly, if you look at history for some kind of evidence for the future, the last three Democrats who won the White House were dark horse political outsiders, all of them. No one counted on Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton, or Barack Obama to come in and win the primary and the general election.
Is there a role for Hillary Clinton, or is she deader than a doornail, Bill?
She's pretty dead. She lost, remember. An embarrassing loss. I know how that happened, by the way. I went around the country and I interviewed Democrats before the election, and they all told me everywhere the same thing. They didn't like or trust Hillary Clinton. They didn't really want to vote for her for president. But you know what they kept saying? She's going to win anyway. She doesn't need my vote. So a lot of them just didn't bother to vote. And look what happened. Yeah. I think her time in the national spotlight is pretty much done. I mean, maybe there'll be an opportunity for her as a former Secretary of State in world affairs and as a spokesperson for women's interests, but I don't see her as having a real political future.
Do you believe that Ukraine is likely to be a dominant issue when voters go to the polls later this year? Bill?
If it's absorbed by Russia, yes. Absent that, it's impossible to predict. But if it becomes part of Russia, it'll be a real embarrassment for Biden because people will say he was too weak, he couldn't do anything about it.
Has he been weak or has he been slow? And I guess there's a similarity between those words. I guess slow is weak. I mean, are there things that he could do that would change that around? I mean, if for some reason he were to come out and change his mind on a no-strike zone, or release all those planes that I guess is still a possible operation, would that perceived weakness change around if he suddenly became a bigger player insofar as military munitions were concerned?
Well, if Ukraine survives as a sovereign, independent country, and the Russians have to retreat, even though they may claim parts of Ukraine, I think Biden will look pretty good. I don't think he'll look like a victor in this, but he'll look pretty good. That's about the best he can hope for. I don't think the election is going to be defined by Ukraine depends on something that's unpredictable, what happens on the ground in the battlefield. But right now, when you ask people what they care about inflation and gas prices.
Chris?
What people know about Vladimir Putin is that he's ruthless, bloodthirsty, and thuggish. You know,
Right.
I saw a documentary a couple nights ago, and I was reminded of there was this a Chechnyan terrorist takeover of a school,
Right.
and there was 1,000 children held hostage. Putin sent in the army. More than 300 children died.
Right.
Died. This is who we're going up against. And when you have Joe Biden, you know, kind of chewing his words, not being able to get a full sentence out, I think that there's a contrast, you know, and I think that lingers in the back of people's minds.
Do the Russian people know that story? I mean, how much of his thuggery is known by the average Russian in the street?
Well,
A lot of them know it and they like it.
Yeah, right.
a
Whether
lot
that's
of
a
them,
majority, we don't know, but
yeah. I mean,
it's not hidden.
yeah. For almost 500 years, you've had a strongman cult of personality in this country. It's in the genes, you could say, from Ivan the Terrible.
Okay, you mean in Russia? Okay.
I'm sorry. Yes, Russia.
right, yeah.
From Ivan the Terrible to present. So that is a source of pride. That this sort of national strength Putin plays to it. But, you know, you're also seeing remarkably something else I think Vladimir Putin didn't account for, the protests. I don't think he realized.
Yeah, that's new.
I don't
Yeah.
think he realized that there was going to be protests in the street.
Yeah.
People risking their own livelihoods.
The reporter who stood up behind the TV commentator, she was on television today with George Stephanopoulos, and I thought she was very powerful. She's not running off to France where asylum has been provided. She talked about her children. She wants to stay in Russia. She talked about her decision to do that. And again, whether obviously a lot of people saw that on their television sets. So whether this thing continues to grow is one of the most interesting things for us to watch in the coming days. Bill Schneider and Chris Veronis join us. I'm Bruce Dumont. When we come back, we'll have a special perspective from a gentleman who is from Ukraine.
Time for me to try. Well, I've got to set myself free. Time for me to try. That's just how it's got to be.
Roll down the windows, turn up the radio, and discover all that Illinois has to offer. Find your road trip at enjoyillinois.com.
Bruce Dumont back. When we continue in a moment, I want to welcome a new guest, but I want to give an opportunity to those that are with us now to take a few moments and briefly introduce themselves. And we're going to begin with Bill Schneider, who is a well-known name, but tell us a little bit more about what you're doing now and some of the activities that you've been involved in recently, Bill.
Well, I just retired from university teaching. I was at CNN for over 20 years. And then about 12 years ago, I retired from CNN and started teaching at George Mason University in the Washington area. I just retired from teaching, but I'm going to continue teaching a lifelong learning course, it's called, for adults. And I write a column for The Hill, the newspaper of Capitol Hill. So I continue to be pretty active in following politics.
Very good. And Chris Veronis joins us in studio. Chris?
I'm Chris Veronis. I'm principal at ESOP Communications Group. It's a public affairs communications shop here in town. Been a legislative staffer in the state legislature here, occasional blogger.
Moderate Republican or conservative Republican?
Conservative Republican, Trump skeptic. Actually, I would say a post-Trump Republican.
Post-Trump Republican. Okay. All right. And we're going to talk about that in hour number 2. The future of the Republican Party will be a topic in hour number 2. But I want to welcome now via phone George Voloshian, and he is a good friend of a good friend of this program, Joe Morris. And when I asked Joe if there was anybody who was born and bred in Ukraine who would be a good guest to join us, he recommended George. George had numerous high-ranking positions in the Reagan administration. But when George and I spoke this afternoon, George, you wanted to make a special point because there's been so much focus on Vladimir Putin and what he does next. You were telling me that your concern is the future of Zelensky, what he does next, the pressures that are specifically on him that may not be known by the outside world. What are they, in your opinion?
Thank you very much. Good evening, Bruce. Thank you very much for inviting me to your wonderful and informative program.
Manchester.
I think that the main points of pressure on President Zelensky, most of the people in the audience have already had a chance to see him on various occasions, speaking directly over the video. And I think they have a very, very good feel as to the kind of truly compassionate and courageous leader he is, who had a chance early on to, I think his famous statement, which was, give me ammo, don't give me a ride, will probably go down in history. But the pressures that he has on him, as you can imagine, are enormous. On the one hand, Putin is constantly urging and pressuring him to make major concessions that would impact on Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity. And Putin is making it very clear in many of these diplomatic discussions that those are the bottom line, and Zelensky would have to go with it if he wants peace. On the other hand, you can imagine what kind of pressures Zelensky is under when he looks out the window and he looks at the video and he sees the massive destruction and the massive carnage and all of the sacrifices and death and wounding that Putin is inflicting on Ukrainians. And now he's caught between these two issues. On the one hand, he could have peace very quickly if he caved in, but he would then put Ukraine's future under a very large question mark in terms of whether it would be able to retain its independence and sovereignty for the longer term. On the other hand, he's basically looking at the numbers, at all the people who are being killed and bombs raining on them, and he obviously feels very, very strongly. Anybody who sees him will recognize how much humanity and compassion he has.
Do you think there are those in Ukraine, those that obviously are very concerned about the death and the destruction of the cities and the people and the refugee situation? At what point might he get a sense that the populace of the nation is beginning to become a little less sure about victory and more concerned about the things that you just referenced, the destruction of cities and the murderous activities and the loss of their friends and neighbors? I mean, at some point, it seems to me that public opinion could turn on him. Or is that just an outside Western perspective?
Bruce, no, it's a very reasonable and a very astute question that you're raising. And you know something? I am just as amazed as you are, because as a matter of fact, I even read some surveys, I think it was earlier this morning, in which as many as 93%, and 93% really is a huge amount, 93% despite all of the bombings, despite all of the destruction, losing their homes, trying to get many of them to the west to have some refuge in Poland and so on, 93% would not want Ukraine to give up its territory and its sovereignty, even at the price of peace. And the determination is so strong that I think there will have to be a much larger number of people who may be killed, who may come close to the point that you are suggesting that they may be heading toward. At this stage,
I want to ask Bill Schneider for his perspective on this. Bill, what is the likelihood that popular opinion and pressure from people living in the West putting on their political leaders a sense that they want those leaders to press Ukraine, either to press them to capitulate, give up Crimea, or give up some of the things that Putin wants for, just because those people that are watching these images, again, from the West, they become tired and worn and depressed at all of the carnage that they're watching on their television sets in the West. I mean, could that political pressure not be coming from the Ukrainian people on Zelensky, but could it be coming through the Western leaders because of populations located in the West, including the United States?
Unlikely. Remember, we have no forces on the ground in Ukraine. That could happen if we were fighting in Ukraine and the fight looked like it was a stalemate and we couldn't win. Then Americans would tire of it and they would put pressure on Ukrainians to make a deal. They'd like to see them make a deal now, but there's not a great deal of pressure for the Ukrainian government to give up. Remember, Zelensky has a price on his head. Putin will destroy him. Putin destroys all of his enemies. Putin is the second incarnation of Joseph Stalin. And Stalin said when he was the premier of the Soviet Union, he once made a remark early on to Lavrenti Beria, the head of his secret police. He said, "The man is a problem. There is no man. There is no problem." That's the way he feels about Zelensky. I wouldn't put a lot of money on Kerensky's survival.
Chris Veronis has a question for you, George.
More of a comment, and that is, I'm sure the world is going to become appalled about what we're going to see, especially because Putin is going to become increasingly desperate. But you have to give props to Zelensky for his courage, but the people on the ground, men, women, unbelievable. I mean, like these images of husbands dropping off their wives and their children at the border and going back. So, it matters much less what the world's appetite for destruction is versus the people who are actually fighting it. And they're showing the entire world we're going to fight. And it's unbelievable.
I'll tell you.
Go ahead, George.
Go ahead. There's something. There was a very interesting number that I saw several days ago that as 350,000 up to that point, 350,000 Ukrainian men who had earlier made their way to Poland with their families came back in order to be able to go ahead and join the fight for Ukraine. Now, many of us may not fully comprehend, what kind of person would do that, would basically go into such a difficult war zone with so many uncertainties and put their lives on the line, even though they already were in the safety of a Poland and with their families and could have set up a very comfortable life in the West. But, Ukrainians had gone through such a extraordinarily difficult period during the Soviet era. So many people were sent to the Gulag. So many people were starved to death. 8 million Ukrainians were starved to death. And that continued from the time, from the early 1920s, actually, from around the Russian Revolution. That's when the reign of
Georgia, we do have to pause now. I want to continue with that, and also I want to ask the question: those Ukrainians who are being moved out of Mariupol and taken back to Russia, what is Putin's idea to do with the people that he's capturing and making prisoners of war? We'll do that when we come back. I'm Bruce DuMont.
STEM is precise, no margin for error.
Dare to forget that. Dare to have fun with it. Get weird with it. Dare to send those old STEM theories flying past the neighbor's house into outer space. Dare to program something internet-breaking, record-breaking. Dare to blow their minds. Dare to learn the difference between sedimentary and metamorphic rock. Go find those rocks. Dare to keep daring. Dare to STEM. Check out She Can STEM to get started.
Flintstones, meet the Flintstones, they're the modern Sonic family. From the town of Fairfield, meet George Jetson. His boy Elroy.
With instant acceleration, electric cars are more fun to drive and more affordable than ever. Electric cars are here. Plug in to the present.
Bruce DuMont back. We continue with our broadcast. I do want to go back to George Voloshin and ask the question that probably people don't want to ask publicly, but I'll do it. What happens if something happens to President Zelensky? How do you think the people react? What about the leadership of the country? Take us through what you think happens next there should that horrible thing happen, George.
Well, the people have essentially recognized and have unified behind the current government. It's not only President Zelensky. President Zelensky obviously inspires them, but the people that he has appointed and who will be taking his place if anything happens to him are also very, very competent and very strong patriotic individuals who the people trust. Because of the availability of Mr. Musk's Skylink program, by which he essentially is able to maintain an internet that unites all of Ukraine.
Okay.
It's going to be extremely difficult for the Russians to try to simply eliminate the leadership and expect the people to lay down their arms, because there are a large number of people who are now in a position to maintain the fight, and they will continue the fight.
But does George, does Vladimir Putin understand that? He's Mr. Old School. Does he understand that in his mind you chop off the head, you lose the future? That he doesn't think about some of these other possibilities of martyrdom.
Well, Vladimir Putin, even though he has been regarded as a genius by some, the fact of the matter is that he has shot himself in the foot so many times. And you could put it correctly, not only is he old school, but he looks at the world through the lens of 30 and 40 years ago. And it is a very much different world out there now. He is used to essentially using very strong repressive measures to keep people under control and under submission. That no longer works anymore, because there are various, there are numerous sources of information now available that in the past were not available in order to inspire or make the people feel that they are a part of a larger resistance to authorities.
Bill Schneider, I have a question for Bill, and I want everybody to respond to it. But Bill, in the last 72 hours, there was this big rally that Putin had. Was that an indication that he was aware of, 21st century, political rallies, a la, what Trump does, or was this, in his view, old school and thinking that it was what Hitler did? I mean,
I don't think of any previous Russian or Soviet leaders having rallies. Very, very few czars had rallies, and very few Soviet leaders had rallies.
So
he wanted to
was
show
he
that his
copying?
country is with him, that he is still an influential and popular figure in his country. And the polling I've seen shows that a majority, not a big majority, but a majority of Russians do support him. Let me give you two things that could happen that could change everything.
Yes.
One, he uses tactical nuclear weapons out of desperation. If that happens, I think the United States would be horrified, and we would probably get directly involved in the conflict. Or chemical weapons. He has chemical weapons, and he could use them. If he does that, the scenario of the whole war would change. Second possibility, I've been hearing talk from a lot of people who have been covering Ukraine that the Russian troops are not being well supplied. The supply lines are very insecure, and they're not getting food, water, weapons, whatever they need. The supplies are now very scarce. There is a distinct possibility we could see some Russian troops defecting from the front lines, defecting in Ukraine, defecting around Ukraine. If that were to happen, it would change everything.
George, your reaction to those two assessments from Bill?
Well, I think Bill's assessment is extremely accurate. The defections that Bill is referring to have actually been occurring very steadily and in large numbers. In fact, about 2 days ago, a battalion of Belarusian troops who had not yet entered Ukraine, but who were pressured to go ahead, and these were Belarusian special forces. In other words, these were true, very heavily trained soldiers. They basically refused to go into Ukraine. These are some of the problems that sometimes we Americans don't understand.
Right.
Is that there is a great deal of unhappiness with Putin, even though the majority of people do support him. Let me just explain that the rally to which you refer,
yes,
was a rally which was very cleverly staged because it was a rally to celebrate the 8th anniversary of the annexation of Crimea. From the Russian perspective, they always felt that Crimea was part of what belonged to them. Of course, there were many previous owners in Crimea, and if anybody has any long-term claim to Crimea, it's either the Tatars or the Ukrainians.
Mm-hmm.
But for about 150 to 200 years, the Russians were dominant in Crimea, and it was a playground with the beaches and so on. So that the rally was staged for the purpose of at the same time, while they were commemorating the 8th anniversary of the annexation of Crimea, the government also included the continuing support for the so-called special military action.
Okay, so people might have come to the rally for a different purpose. George, on that moment, we're out of time. George Voloshin has been our guest. Thanks very much. Bill Schneider, always great to have you with us. Thanks very much for being with us. Chris Veronis, you'll continue with us in hour number 2 as we talk about the future of the Republican Party.
Roll over. Chance high five. All right. When you adopt a shelter pet, you discover all the things that make them unique. And your mother and... I am totally a hot person. Right, guys? Thanks for being honest. They're a little bit of a lot of things, but they're all pure love. Adopt pure love at theshelterpetproject.org.
Dallas, St. Louis, Nashville, Tuscaloosa. All major cities to feel the destruction caused by a direct hit from a tornado. Is Chicago next? It's not a question of if, but when, and the clock is ticking. Learn what to do now at ready.illinois.gov to become tornado ready.
Type 2 diabetes can have a big impact on your life, but how can it be prevented? Well, the first step is knowing if you have prediabetes, a serious medical condition that puts you at high risk for type 2 diabetes. 1 in 3 American adults has prediabetes, but more than 80% don't know they have it. The good news is, prediabetes can be reversed, and for many people, healthy changes in their daily routine can make a big difference. Take the 1-minute risk test today at doihaveprediabetes.org.